You asked, why do you call yourself a modern watercolorist and not a mixed media artist? Well, in all honesty, it's mainly due to the supplies I use, how I use them, plus a pretty dramatic story of how I learned I wasn't a traditional watercolorist. But I'll get into that in a second. In my previous video, I actually discussed the difference between modern watercolor and traditional watercolor, or basically regular watercolor. So if you didn't watch that video, please make sure to check it out in the link down below. Some of you were curious after that video aired why I didn't call myself just a mixed media artist, but rather a modern watercolorist or a mixed media watercolorist, which is how this video came to be about. So here's my story of why I don't really like to refer to myself as a mixed media artist. I gotta admit, college was pretty rough for me. I honestly struggled a lot in school, and it was one of the most emotional roller coaster rides I had been in my life. There was a lot of stress going on, which is school dynamic, as well as family dynamic stuff that was going on in the background. So needless to say, there was a lot of awesome highs during that time, as well as really horrible lows. And in order to kind of process through all of that, I would often draw or paint inside of my dorm room. For one particular year, I made what I deemed some pretty awesome artwork. So I decided to take my art to a local county fair and showcase it kind of just for kicks. I'd often done this as a child and entered my art into age categories based on grade. But now that I was an adult, I needed to specify what medium of art I was entering into. The categories at that time included photography, watercolor, oil, acrylic, and then this massive category of mixed media. I, of course, labeled my artwork watercolor, thinking that is what I had painted. My art piece was composed of watercolor, graphite pencil, and a little bit of white gouache for highlights. After standing in line for some time to submit my work under this watercolor category, I was then met with, some not so positive responses. As soon as the lady working the desk took my painting in her hands, she immediately shoved it back into mine and said with disgust, "Wrong table." Confused, I said, "But I painted with watercolor." She then proceeded to say, "Is that all you used?" Confused, I told her I had used some gouache for highlights. But before I could even finish, basically she pointed to the mixed media table and told me in a very demeaning voice, "Over there." Needless to say, I was really confused, but I walked over to the mixed media table and once again waited in line to submit my work. While I was looking around, basically waiting for the line to slim out, most of the artwork in this location was mainly acrylic as well as ink. There really wasn't any watercolor to be seen, which made me really curious because in my mind, what I had painted fit more into the watercolor category than the mixed media category. After some time, once again, I stood before another lady and tried to submit my artwork. But before I did, I actually asked the lady why my art piece was considered mixed media instead of watercolor. The lady also was a bit confused as well, staring at my art piece and then comparing it to what was behind her that had already been submitted, to which she then proceeded to call the previous woman who had shooed me over to this table, to her table and then asked basically the same question. Why was my watercolor piece not considered watercolor? Why was it considered mixed media? The previous woman then proceeded to inform me that only true, and I put true in quotes, watercolor paintings could only be submitted into her category and that mine was not considered a true watercolor painting. since I had used gouache. With that short, albeit kind of curt explanation, she then proceeded to say, "Rules are rules," and then quickly walked away from both of us, which left us both a little bit confused. Now, I get it. Rules are rules, and this was an art competition. And she really wanted her watercolor category to be quote unquote pure. I totally get that now, but at the time I was really confused. And this honestly had not been the first time that I had encountered this particular attitude. I had actually encountered this lots of times when I was younger too, taking watercolor classes. And whenever I would suggest, hey, let's try this particular supply, or this would be really cool to add, I was kind of met with this demeaning attitude of, no, we'd never do that. And honestly, I was always curious why there was this feeling of disgust almost that you would even consider adding a different supply to your watercolor. It was almost as if true watercolor, or basically when you are painting with only watercolor, was considered this high elite form of art, but then mixed media was kind of considered this trash form of art that only people who weren't considered the elite would fall into. And basically, as a result, I kind of felt like I was a trash artist being associated with this category. So, needless to say, when I went home that night, I felt pretty lame after the whole ordeal. Now, I do want to clarify, I do not think or consider mixed media art as kind of this trash art, as these previous teachers that I had been underneath, and even this lady that I encountered, had kind of given me this feeling. I honestly think there's nothing wrong with mixed media. I think there's nothing wrong with even painting with watercolor the traditional way, basically the purest way. There's nothing wrong with either of those realms. It's just that my first impression of this world was not a positive one. So it really shaped how I viewed that particular term. And to be honest, I really struggled with the term mixed media for many, many years after that because of how it was kind of, this persona was pushed onto me of what it was. Which is why I actually started calling myself on YouTube a misfit when it came to watercolor. That's kind of how this name came about. I just decided to take a completely different approach and, well, break the rules of watercolor, which is why the slogan of this channel is watercolor that breaks the rules. For me, I just wanted to create stuff that made me feel good, and I didn't want to limit myself to any rules or any supplies that I couldn't touch, because that was considered outside of the boundaries of watercolor. Now, I'm going to say most people won't ever encounter the same experience that I had, but it still does happen based on the comments from the previous video, where someone will submit their work as watercolor and they use a supply in a very minimal way, and a teacher or someone who is in this field of the art realm will critique them and kind of shoo them away and even make them feel bad about themselves for including that particular supply. So yeah, that's my story, and hopefully that answered some of your questions from the previous video that I uploaded. I know this video is going to be a little bit long, but since it was a story time, I thought y'all might enjoy a little bit longer of a video for me to just clarify some questions that you had on the previous video. Now, if you have any more questions about this particular topic, or you have some other topics that you would like for me to discuss in the future, please make sure to leave that down below, and let's keep on going with this conversation. So thanks again, everyone, for watching, and until next time, happy painting!